Good evening and welcome to our Thursday night digital discussion in partnership tonight with the Milwaukee County War Memorial Center. We have a very exciting talk with Tom Fehring, who you see right below me, about the Milwaukee during World War II. And so I can't wait to get to that. But while you're getting comfy, maybe grabbing a drink, maybe grabbing a snack, I'm just going to go over some of the things that are going on between our two organizations. So first, I'm going to tell you that the Milwaukee County War Memorial Center, we're very happy to be partnering with them tonight on this talk. And I want to let you know that the exhibit that Tom is going to tell you a lot more about is actually going on until year end. So you can have a chance to check that out, celebrating, commemorating rather, the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Also, the exhibit going on right now at the Milwaukee County Historical Society is about politics, something people can't get enough of at the moment. So it's Better, Bigger, Brighter, 150 years of Milwaukee politics. We have that going on through the election for sure. So into November on that one. So you have plenty of times to brush up on Milwaukee politics. Next week's program is a Halloween program, though the title might have you thinking it is a politics program. It's called Spooky and Scandalous Milwaukee. But it's a Halloween program with Anna Lardenoy, who has written a couple of different books about the spookier and more scandalous sides of Milwaukee history. So we'll get in the festive spirit with that next week, 7:30, same place, same time here. And then we also have a Halloween history and beer bike ride about haunted Milwaukee going on both the 24th and the 31st of October. If you are interested in joining us for those history and beer bike rides, it's a great way to still get out and enjoy the weather safely and distanced and whatnot. But you can go to MilwaukeeHistory.net to find out more about that. But on to the main event for tonight, which is with Tom Fehring about Milwaukee during World War II. So, Tom, I'll let you take it away. If you have any questions, please put those in the comments, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end. But yeah, Tom, it's all you.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Appreciate the introduction. Well, what I want to talk about this evening is the efforts the city of Milwaukee industry put into supporting the effort of the war effort during the course of World War II. I like this introductory slide here, which shows the A.O. Smith factory. A.O. Smith built millions of bombshells, large welded vessels, of course, that held explosives. And I think this shot is particularly arty of if you could say that, for a bomb. I thought it'd be helpful to start the presentation providing some key dates. The war is generally recognized, Second World War start is generally recognized as September 1st of 39. Some people would dispute that. Certainly Japan was already in a warring mode well before that, and there were certain other incursions and things from Hitler's Germany that were going on before that. But generally, September 1st of 39 is accepted as the date that the Second World War started. The United States didn't really enter the war until 2 years later. Immediately as a result of Pearl Harbor, and then when the United States and Japan entered war. Immediately, Germany declared war upon the United States, so we entered the war on two fronts during that period of time. In that period between when the September 1st and December of 41, the United States was already providing munitions, providing supplies under the Lend-Lease program to Britain. So the United States and Milwaukee industry was already getting involved prior to that date. Things didn't begin to turn until mid-1944 with the Normandy invasion, and then that led to the Battle of the Bulge, December of 44. Germany surrendered May 7th of 45. The Japanese unconditional surrender was August 14th. And then the formal Japanese surrender on the battleship, September 2nd. So, it's really a 6-year period between when Germany invaded Poland and until the succession of all capabilities of all warfare that was going on between the countries. And then it took many months after that for the United States soldiers to get back. We had millions of soldiers that were in Europe and in the Philippines, Australia, and other places, and it took a long time. Certainly, it took well beyond year end before the soldiers came home. But the September 2nd, 1945 date, it was 75 years ago, actually 75 years and a few days. But because of that, the folks at the War Memorial Center decided that it would be appropriate to recognize, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the succession of hostilities associated with the Second World War. I've got a few quotes here that I'd like to kind of set the stage for my presentation. Franklin Roosevelt in '43 said, "Every combat division, every naval task force, every squadron of fighting planes is dependent for its equipment and ammunitions and fuel and food on the American people in civilian clothes in the offices and factories and on the farms at home." We typically don't recognize the efforts that were made by the Milwaukeeans that were not engaged directly in battle, were not serving in the armed forces, but they were engaged either in supplying goods and services to the war effort by working in the factories in the Milwaukee area, or they were also working on farms and other facilities just to supply the nation during this period of time. John Ward has this interesting quote: "The battle of the World War II were won as much on the assembly line as on the firing line." And then a quote, why the Allies won: "American industry provided almost 2/3 of all the Allied military equipment produced during the war." And just to give you some sense as to the scope of that, 300,000 aircraft, 193,000 large artillery pieces, 2 million Army trucks, 80,000 landing craft. If you look at the number of ships, 1,500 Navy warships and 5,600 merchant ships, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and 6 million tons of bombs. Just an incredible amount of armament that was produced, and a lot of it in Milwaukee being one of the principal centers of the United States' industrial output during the course of the war. The exhibit that John had talked about started August 1st. It's going to run until year end. The exhibit's free, so that if you have time, and it's easy to socially distance. The exhibit is set up so that you can take a self-guided tour through the facility. It's a lot of space in that area, so from a COVID standpoint, I don't think there should be any risk or concerns of attending the exhibit. I very much suggest, if you have the opportunity, and of course it's right on Milwaukee's warfront, so it's a nice setting for all of that. I thought it'd be helpful just to show a quick slideshow. A couple weeks ago, I took my camera along and just took a quick walk through the facility. So John, if you could show that video. Well, thank you, Jen. So that gives you an idea about what's displayed in that space. As you can imagine, that's really just a very small snippet of the types of things that were produced by Milwaukee during the course of the war. In order to complement that, I thought it would be appropriate to put together a book to kind of talk about many of the other things that were produced in the Milwaukee area. The book includes the things that are shown on the floor of the exhibit, but many of the items, like for example the steam turbines that are shown on the cover, they're either much too big or they no longer exist, or they're bombs or things that you just could not display in an exhibit like this. So the book is meant as a complement to go along with the exhibit. And the book showcases, munitions, equipment, supplies built in Milwaukee for the war effort, discusses the things that Milwaukeeans were doing to supply the fighting forces, as well as the sacrifices that were made in Milwaukee. The bonds that were purchased, the victory gardens that were tended and liked by Milwaukeeans, and also the sacrifices. There were so many food stuff and other things that people could not acquire during the war, and had the sacrifice as a part of that. And it also commemorates those that served in uniform and in the factories to achieve victory. The book itself covers the contributions of more than 30 Milwaukee industrial companies during the war. In my talk this evening, I'm just going to highlight just a few of those companies, some of what I think are the most significant contributions. If you want to go beyond that, I would urge you to get a copy of the book. So I'm going to start with A.O. Smith. And the reason being is I think A.O. Smith's initial contribution, which occurred before the United States' involvement of the war, was very significant and is relatively unknown. Prior to the war effort, German submarines were sinking oil tankers that were carrying vital petroleum from the Gulf states to the East Coast refineries. I believe in about a 3-month period, we lost about 50 merchant ships that were carrying, oil tankers that were carrying oil, because the German submarines were, trying to prevent the United States from supplying the Allies with fuel products. And so very, very quickly we needed to do something, and an emergency project was undertaken to build 2 pipelines. The pipelines were called the Big Inch and the Little Inch. A.O. Smith provided a good portion of the pipe that was required to make the project. I've got an interesting, these little boxes here on screen, those were the pumping stations. Almost all the pumps were supplied by Ellis Chambers in Milwaukee. So Milwaukee industry had a very, very big role in making this emergency project occur on schedule and to prevent the loss of petroleum products during the early parts of the war. Got an interesting video that was put together for A.O. Smith during the course of Second World War. I think this is a 1944 date. So John, if you could launch that video.
Yes, it's line pipe. Rugged, capable, welded pipe made by the exclusive Smithway process. One small part in the thousands of miles of steel arteries that mean so much to our way of life is shaped into a broad letter U, the first of 3 steps. The abutting edges with a weld that's as strong as the steel itself. First, a locating lug is welded to each end of the tube. Then it enters one of the $1 million machines that welds the 40-foot length in a few seconds. A water-cooled arbor inside the pipe will expand to clamp the two edges against electrical contacts. A 1,000,000 ampere arc surges across the line of contact, heating the 40-foot edges until the steel becomes semi-liquid. Just after the current is cut off, the edges are bumped together by the hydraulic mechanism. This makes the weld and squeezes out the oxides formed by the heating. The result is a clean, sound, strong union of the abutting edges. And there goes another load of Smithway line pipe. Service-proved, light in weight for its strength, uniform and accurate in quality and dimensions. More pipe for the thousands of miles of steel arteries that carry the lifeblood of our nation.
Okay, well, the entire video that this was extracted for goes about 20 minutes or so, and it may have been just a little bit choppy, but what was being produced were 40-foot lengths of 24-inch pipe in this case. You know, there's the one scene where you know, the individual pipe sheets are being upended just a little bit, and then it goes over to the next die, and then it's made into a U shape, and then the third die in which it's rolled all the way over. There's other steps in the process that I didn't include in the video. For example, there's a whole process, of course, to clean the weld along the 40-foot length of the pipe. Then the pipe itself is capped, was pressurized inside a die to and overpressurized so that the pipe itself would expand to the full dimensions of the die and ensure that the pipe itself was as round as possible. And there's steps, of course, to trim the ends of the pipe and the like. But it was an incredible effort by A.O. Smith, and nobody had the technology that they did at the time. A.O. Smith's welding expertise was literally the best in the world. The company also used its welding techniques, as I mentioned earlier, to produce casings for large bombs. They produced an incredible 4.5 million large bomb casings during the course of the war. They also produced propeller blades, 46,000, 47,000 of them during the course of the war. And then they provided a lot of guidance to the Navy on welding techniques for the Liberty ship program. And then those techniques were carried over to warships as well. You know, prior to welding the hulls for ships, they were all riveted construction. Welding provided great economy. Not only did it significantly reduce the amount of manpower that went into producing the ships, it also significantly reduced the time, and it allowed techniques to be employed that were never previously considered. For example, a good portion of some of the destroyer escorts. So this is destroyer escorts were slightly smaller than you know, full destroyers, but they sections of them were fabricated in Colorado, miles and miles away from the oceans. But they were fabricated and shipped by train to the coast, where the individual sections then could be welded into place. And it allowed the United States to use, you know, any weld shop that was located any place in the country could get involved in the program if they had sufficient capability. And it allowed the United States to significantly ramp up construction schedules, to reduce the amount of time that it took to produce the ships, and a lot of that came from the use of the welding capability that A.O. Smith really brought to focus during the course of the Second World War. Moving on to Ellis-Chalmers. Ellis-Chalmers was the largest Milwaukee area employer at the time. It was a real manufacturing juggernaut. They were called to play a very significant role in the Second World War. This illustration here shows steam turbines being produced, which powered numerous warships. We also, Ellis-Chalmers also produced many condensers that would take the exhaust steam from the steam engines, condense it to water, and then the water, of course, is returned to the boilers. The boiler heats it over again, passes through the steam turbines. I believe this was the 1,000th condenser that was being manufactured at the time. And they had a little ceremony to recognize that. The company also built superchargers, which enabled aircraft to operate at very high altitudes. You can see the supercharger located on the bottom portion of this aircraft. The way the supercharger would work, the exhaust from the aircraft engine would pass through the lower part of it. You can see the red turbine wheel. So the exhaust is passing through the turbine wheel, powering that turbine wheel. The turbine wheel, of course, is connected to an impeller on the top, and the impeller is being used to provide pressurized air to the engine. Engines operating, especially internal combustion engines operating at high altitude, would operate at significantly reduced horsepower without the boost of a supercharger. Supercharger allowed our military planes to operate as high as 35,000 feet. And a lot of our bombers, especially the B-29s, operating at 35,000 feet, they were largely out of range of enemy air armaments, and they were also out of range of a lot of the enemy planes. And as a result of that, a lot of the bombing operations were able to occur in daylight hours by Allied forces that would not have been able to occur otherwise. Ellis-Chalmers built an incredible 100,000 of these turbo superchargers, totaling 16 million horsepower. And by the way, almost all of them were produced by women. The turbo supercharger plant in West Ellis was probably employed by 70 or 80% women in the factory. Ellis-Chalmers also produced the magnetic coils for the enrichment of uranium as part of the Manhattan Project. This little snippet, and it's a little out of focus. You can see there's a time-lapse effort here so that people have shadows. But what you can see them doing is taking the metal windings for one of the magnetic coils. I'm going to show you the full photograph. The detail that I showed earlier is just the center of it, but you can see the metal winding itself off of a spool. Because of shortages of copper during the course of the war, it was decided that the Treasury would allow the use of silver. So silver directly out of the United States Treasury went into producing these coils in order to make sure that there was, we could get these in service in time to meet the demands for the Manhattan Project. A couple other interesting, I find this photograph very interesting because of a lot of the details. You can see the assembly that I highlighted earlier. Then to the right side, there's a rectangular assembly. I believe the coil itself goes into the rectangular assembly. And if you look at the bosses on the side of that, I'd just like to point that out because in another slide coming up, it'll be evident where the coil was used in the magnetic separation process. Also, if you'd look, the wooden wall that's providing a partition between the final assembly activities and the rest of the plant was kind of interesting. In order to provide the highest amount of security as possible, the management and armed forces that were overseeing the operation, they didn't want workers that were working on sub-assemblies to see the final assembled product, so that a wooden barrier wall was erected, essentially to provide line of sight security or secrecy. I would guess that even the workers that were working on the assemblies, they probably didn't quite know what they were making. They knew they were making a coil. It was maybe a magnetic coil, but they certainly had little idea about what its ultimate use was going to be. Finally, in his photograph, if you can look to the left of that sub-assembly that I first showed, and you can see a desk off to the left and what appears to be a clerk working behind it. Because of the use of silver for this project, there were a whole team of auditors that went and worked around the clock to track the use of silver, to make sure that the silver was being used and any scrap silver was being, obviously not being discarded, not being pilfered, in order to inventory all of the silver use. That they had auditors that were working around the clock. And then if you could look at the floorboards throughout the factory, when the entire effort was done and the machinery had been removed, the floorboards were all taken up and were burned in order to entrap any remaining silver that may have been embedded into the floorboards. And the accountants that worked the inventory claimed to have been able to account for all of the for all of the silver that was used during the course of the operation. There were also signs included around the factory. This one in particular, and this was the Hawley plant, by the way. The Hawley plant, which is located Hawley Road, just south of I-94. The building itself continues to be used for other purposes today, but that building, a very large building, was built specifically for this project. And there was signage on the property. Hold your tongue. The job's not done. Silence means security. There was a lot of emphasis placed into the need for security throughout this project, as well as other projects in the Milwaukee area. This is where this all went. Remember I told you to look at those bosses that were on the side of those rectangular boxes? Well, you can see all of these rectangular boxes in a circuit, the racetrack, if you would. This was the Calderon at the Y12 plant. There were a number of these. I don't know the exact number, but in order to make sure that we could enrich enough uranium to be used in the Manhattan Project that went ultimately to build the atomic bomb, several of these were put into operation, and Ellis Chalmers provided the coils for all of them. So that's the electromagnetic separation process. But you may recall at Oak Ridge there was also a gaseous separation project. Nobody had ever done this before, and nobody really knew the best technology to be used. And there was also an expectation, and I believe that they actually used both operations sequentially, so that you could refine. You're taking essentially U-238, which has a little U-235 in it, and you want to enrich it so there's more and more U-235. If you get that ratio high enough of U-235, then it could be used to build an atomic bomb. The gaseous diffusion process used 6,000 pumps, and as the project started, they went out to 4 different major pump manufacturers. Everybody turned them away except Ellis Chalmers. Ellis Chalmers was the only company willing to take the project on. Everybody was worried about the sealing. They, knowing the gases that were going to be included and used in these pumps, they didn't believe that they could adequately seal them properly. What came about at the same period of time, however, was Teflon had just been recently developed. And by taking solid Teflon material and machining them into seals, they were able to use Teflon seals. for these pumps, which proved to be adequate for the job. Here's just a very small portion of the gaseous diffusion plant. This was the world's largest building at the time that it was installed, with 6,000 of these individual pumps and its associated filter. Little diagram here shows how they used a very high filtration vessels, so that the one portion of the filter would be seeing the higher the U235, and it would go from filter to filter to filter to filter, all being pumped along the way, because the pressure drop across these filters was quite large. So you needed these 6,000 pumps. Then another track was taking the less enriched uranium streams. So you had these two streams going counter flow to one another, and magically it worked. Another area that's probably wasn't publicized much, and a lot of people don't know about, was the precision bomb fuses that were manufactured during the course of the war. Milwaukee companies, including Badger Meter, Briggs & Stratton, Evinrude, Globe Union, all were producing millions of fuses that were used to detonate military bombs. And as the course of the war went on, the fuses became increasingly sophisticated. What was unknown by most people, very few people actually knew this, but the United States had developed a proximity fuse to improve the accuracy of the bombs. It was a very highly classified U.S. secret. In fact, during the course of the war, bombs with proximity fuses were initially only used for naval operations. We were certainly concerned that if any unexploded bomb had been captured by the enemy, they could disassemble the fuses and find out the circuitry involved in it, and figured the chances of that occurring, of course, in naval operations were very, very small. So initially, it was only used in naval operation, and then later on was used. When the Germans were bombing London later in the course of the war, the artillery's U.S. artillery involved in that was using proximity fuses. The way a proximity fuse works, by the way, and I've got a little video again that's going to demonstrate this, is the proximity fuse has several circuits. One circuit is used to begin to arm it at the right point. These fuses had to be very, very rugged, because they're being fired by artillery at extreme forces. And they had to withstand that. And of course, you didn't want the bomb to blow up prematurely. So there was a timer circuit to give it a chance to essentially launch toward its target. And then began sending a radio signal. So there was a signal to circuit to transmit this radio signal. And then there was a circuit to receive this radio signal. So the radio signal is being sent out from the fuse. And then when it would be reflected back by another object, it would say, "Oh, I now am able to read this radio fuse radio signals. So there must be a solid object someplace in the vicinity," and then it would bomb, and then it would explode. So that's in layman's terms, I guess, the way that circuit worked. Central Lab, which was a division of Globe Union located in Milwaukee's River West neighborhood, they were called upon to develop the world's smallest fuse circuit to be designed to be mounted on the head of mortar shells. If mortar shell, I don't know, maybe a foot in length at the most, including the fuse itself. Very, very small. This is a diagram to show the mortar, to show the fuse that at the end of it. Some people consider the development of the printed circuit board by Central Lab as the greatest advance in electronics since the vacuum tube at that time. It was known as a thick film hybrid circuit, but it was, essentially a printed circuit onto similar to, what we see with circuit boards today. The entire circuit now, the circuit, so it's got a timing, it's got a radio transmitter, it's got a radio receiver, and it's got a device to trigger the bomb itself. That entire circuit was only 1 1/4 inch by 1 3/4 inches, and it was extremely rugged. The circuit itself included, the resistors were printed right into the circuitry. In some cases, capacitors were printed as part of the circuitry. In other cases, they were soldered into place. And then they used miniature vacuum tubes that were very, very rugged, that had been developed by others during the course of the war, because those vacuum tubes had to withstand incredible forces. We're going to start a video in just a moment to kind of help demonstrate this just a little bit further and show you the advantages that the proximity fuse brought. But if you look just in the lower right corner of this photograph, that's the Centralab fuse developed for use on mortars, as opposed to the other fuses that were located in there. As you can see, they were considerably larger. So John, if you could launch this video.
The major advancement in ordnance to emerge from World War II is the VT, or proximity fuse. A top secret project during the war, the details of construction and operation are still a secret. Some of its unique properties, however, may now be described.
Suicide pilots. These special diagrams tell the story better than words. First, an ordinary bomb exploding on contact. We've no doubt about the success of this deadly invention. Plenty of contact.
Well, that video is a little choppy. It's actually snippets of 3 different videos, but I thought it'd give you a better feel for exactly the utility of a proximity circuit. In the mortar proximity circuit was not used for mortar shells, was not used until the Battle of the Bulge. So right at the end of the war, the German soldiers involved in it called it hellfire. There was no way to escape it, if you would. They can't, as the video illustrates, merely being in a trench did not provide you adequate protection. You couldn't really hide from it. And it's credited with significantly turning the tide in the Battle of the Bulge. It's also credited with saving a lot of U.S. naval vessels, because when used, in aircraft or airborne artillery rather against enemy aircraft, it significantly increased the kill rate, the hit rate, if you will. And even well after the war, most people didn't even know of his existence, and details that really didn't begin coming out until mid to late 50s. Interestingly enough, Centralab's got an interesting history, I think. After the war, they hired Jack Kilby directly out of college. I think Jack had actually put in a little bit of time in the reserves right toward the end of the war, but he was younger. He was too young to go into the service at the time, got his college degree a couple of years after the war ended. And but Jack Kilby was hired by Central Lab to continue to work on these miniature circuitry and to, at the period of time when Jack got involved, the transistor had just been developed. So for the first time, they were able to print a fully electronic circuit, if you would, on a printed circuit board, very small sizes. They were used for hearing aids and similar devices like that. Jack Kilby went on to develop the world's first microchip when he left Central Lab, and a few weeks later, he was working for Texas Instruments down in the Dallas area and developed the world's first microchip. So, you know, you can kind of trace that whole development back to Central Lab's effort, which started during the course of the Second World War. Moving on, Cutler Hammer. And again, a lot of people don't realize this, but Cutler Hammer has provided control circuitry, motor controllers for the military since 1908. In fact, 100% of the Navy fleet has used Cutler Hammer motor controls, continues to use Cutler Hammer motor controls. As the Second World War was starting, well, you know, first of all, Cutler Hammer was providing controls for all branches of the service, including many of our aircraft. The B-29 alone had 70 Cutler Hammer switches. The complexity of warships and submarines, especially going into the Second World War, required extensive use of motor controls, and Cutler Hammer was called upon to provide many of the motor controls, but ran into problems under battle conditions. The brutal shock waves that were caused by enemy explosives that, you know, they didn't need to hit the ship. If they were falling close to the ship, the jarring forces could trigger a motor control that was in the on position, could jar it in an off position, and vice versa. And the Navy determined that a near miss could temporarily disable its warship. And it took a while to get the warship back and properly controlled again. You had to figure out which motor control was in the wrong position, and obviously that was a situation that could not continue, and Cutler Hammer was tasked with redesigning motor controls to eliminate the problem. This issue was not unique to Cutler Hammer at the time, but they were tasked with redesigning and solving the problem. They ended up, as I understand, they were mounting the motor controls on a large steel sheet, and then they would wrap it with a weighted hammer that would, you know, essentially simulate the type of jarring force that the motor controls were seeing caused by enemy explosives, and having to try to redesign it to make sure that that indeed would not induce a misoperation of the motor controllers. And they successfully solved the problem. The Navy was so happy with their solution to it that, you know, they ultimately sole sourced the production of motor controls for a good portion of the Navy fleet. Cutler Hammer eventually spun off its Navy control business to DRS Technologies, which is located in Milwaukee. In fact, they're building a brand new plant out on the northwest side right now. They continue to design, test, manufacture equipment for naval and marine power distribution systems right here in Milwaukee. Okay, I'm going to go on to a couple other areas. I just want to mention, you know, this is a list of the other companies that are included in the book. There are over 30 companies, and, you know, almost all of these companies have manufactured multiple devices for the war efforts. So the book itself includes probably over 100 different devices or supplies or equipment for the military during the course of the Second World War. And I think Milwaukee can feel rightly proud of its industrial output during the course of the war. The Army-Navy developed a program they called the Excellence in Production Awards. It was a joint effort by the Army and the Navy to encourage industrial mobilization and production of war materials. And they had a lengthy list of measures to determine what companies qualified for receiving the award, including quality and quantity of production and overcoming obstacles and strikes and using fair labor practices and standards, if you would. It was only granted to about 5% of U.S. manufacturers. However, in Milwaukee, 68 companies were granted the Army-Navy E Award, and they received a total of 268 awards. Once an award was given, you were eligible to receive it every 6 months. Initially, you would receive a flag, and then 6 months later, if your productivity standards continued to meet the standards established by the Army and Navy Review Board, then you were granted a star. And so, you know, numerous stars were granted to Milwaukee industrial firms. I've got just a few photographs to kind of show, you know, the presentations that were made to the various companies. Typically, there would be a gathering of employees along with dignitaries from the Army and Navy and typically the top brass of the company. This photograph is from Bucyrus Erie in South Milwaukee when they received their award. This scoop, I think, is Cutler Hammer. I think both of these images are Cutler Hammer celebrations of receiving the award. Here's one from Laddish. This is A.B. Zuckert's company, which made raincoats during the course of the war, raincoats and ponchos. And Mr. Zuckert is shown accepting the award with one of the female employees that was standing to represent the other employees of the company. And this is Harley Davidson, of course. And you can see, you know, on their banner they've got a star. You know, that's I think maybe their first star. I think they may have received more than one for their efforts during the course of the war. Typically, the employees themselves were also granted a pin with the E, you know, signifying excellence in production. So if any of your parents perhaps were in the war and you're going through their things at some point, if you've ever come across one of these pins, that's what that's all about. Also, you know, there's a section in the book talking about the role that Milwaukeeans played in the home front in other ways. There were a lot of signs. The exhibit, as you might have seen, the walls are just rung with different posters that were produced by the War Council. I forget exactly what the group was called, but there were hundreds and hundreds of posters that were built during that period of time. Right now, seeing all of the political signs on people's front lawns, you know, it kind of, you know, draws that. I draw a comparison to that. I don't think people at that period of time had lawn signs to promote the war effort, but there were numerous posters that were installed within factories and grocery stores and schools and everything. Here you can see another one on the left where an employee is using a Milwaukee electric drill where she's being called to do the job that he left behind. And it, you know, brings up the issue that during the course of the Second World War in Milwaukee, about 25% of the jobs were held by women. You know, the men, as they were drafted or they volunteered for the service, they left huge gaps in the manufacturing companies. And initially, they hired women. They eventually began hiring African Americans, and it caused a significant social impact on Milwaukee. People, African Americans from southern states, moved to Milwaukee, moved to other industrial areas because of jobs were available, good paying jobs. Not that there wasn't hardship, however. You know, a lot of the African American employees were discriminated against. In fact, there was a campaign that an African American group started, national campaign, really to address that issue. they called it the double victory program. They were looking for victory against the enemy, but they were also looking victory at home, so that they would get fair treatment and fair practices within the factories and the like. As the war ended, most, if not all, of the women left the workforce and readily gave up their jobs as the men came and backfilled. Men came home and they took these jobs over again. But the African Americans largely continued to be employed in the factories. So this really was a major change in the northern industrial areas for the first time that African Americans were employed in the factories, and largely holding down good, solid jobs, relatively high-paying jobs. There's also a chapter of the book dealing with the celebrations and the commemorations that have been taking place following the war. Of course, the newspapers had screaming headlines as the war ended, especially in August 15th, when word began coming out that the Japanese had surrendered unconditionally. There was a unplanned gathering. People, from factories, from homes all around the city came downtown, started strolling down Wisconsin Avenue, men, women, kids, families, celebrating the occasion. I liked this grouping here in front of Gimbel's on Wisconsin Avenue. There's a grouping of young ladies that are dancing, literally dancing in the street. Another image that people obviously posing for the cameras, but you can see all of the young people that had come downtown to celebrate the end of the war. And then, of course, there were many ceremonies held to commemorate those that had served in the war and those that didn't come home. This shot here on the left is an honor roll of residents in Whitefish Bay that had participated in the war, and a list of those that had served, and of course a list of those that had given their lives during the course of the war. So that's it. The book. It's available at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, Historic Milwaukee, Boswell, Amazon, for $12.99. There's also a Kindle version available for $4.99. And if you want to get a broader picture for what Milwaukee contributed to the war effort, you might take a look. There's over 100 photographs in it, I'd be very interested in any feedback from you as you have an opportunity to view it. I've also written a book that covers Milwaukee's industrial heritage in more broad terms. It looks at 100 years of Milwaukee industrial history, and that book is also available in local area stores and like. And I should mention in both cases the book, the large book, the proceeds all go to the Milwaukee County Historical Society. The book on Second World War, the proceeds go to the Milwaukee War Memorial Center, so that if you do purchase it, you should know that the profits, the proceeds from the books are going to a good cause. So if there are any questions that, John, I assume that you've probably been accumulating some.
Yeah, no, I think that was a fascinating presentation. You hear so much about what happened abroad during the war, and it's great that you put together such a history of what was happening here at home, and especially with Milwaukee being such a Rust Belt blue collar city, and that referred to as such, and how that came into being, and that kind of thing. So if anybody does have any questions, now is the time to ask. You can put them right in the comments wherever you're watching, be it Facebook or YouTube, and Tom will be happy to answer those. I do just want to mention too that we're very grateful that Tom has chosen to contribute the proceeds of those books back to the organizations that help make them, both the Historical Society and the War Memorial Center. We have both of those books for sale right now in the bookstore, online, or if you show up in person, we're open basically normal business hours. So here's the I'll just put the link in right now for the book about the presentation you just heard tonight about Milwaukee during World War II. But to get the discussion going a little bit, again, if you have any questions, please put those in the comments. But I'll kick it off, and that is this book's all about Milwaukee and industrial output during World War II. And like you said, there were 30 some odd companies that were basically involved in the war effort through that angle here in Milwaukee. Was that unique that so many businesses were concentrated in one metropolitan area during this time, or was that something that you saw clusters of around the country?
Yeah, well, first of all, there were 68 Milwaukee area companies that received the productivity awards. So there were even more than that. There were probably well over 100 Milwaukee area companies involved in the effort. So it was pretty expansive, and there was an expectation during the course of the war that was enforced. That if you were making automobiles prior to the course of the war, you were expected to turn your facility over for the cause of the war, so that all industrial clusters within the United States, and of course most of those were located in the northern industrial belt, really were involved. So Milwaukee was one of maybe a dozen areas. We were probably sixth or eighth or so in the total production in the Milwaukee area, because we were a major center, but also Detroit was, Indianapolis, Cleveland certainly, Schenectady because of General Electric. There were other U.S. Industrial areas that did played a significant role. A lot of the Midwestern areas, they were also seen because they were relatively insulated. They weren't on the coast, so that, and of course, as the war was going, nobody really knew whether this war was actually going to be coming to our shores. So that, some of the things like the Manhattan efforts, to have them, those assemblies to be produced here in Milwaukee, I think was felt. There was probably some security elements involved in all of that as well, and so. But yeah, Milwaukee certainly played its role in helping to end this war.
Sure. Renee has a question here. We'll pop that up on the screen. She said, you said that 5% of manufacturers nationwide got the E award and 68 alone were in Milwaukee. Any idea what percentage that was for Milwaukee? So you said over 100. Or were we ahead of the national curve, I guess, is the...
I'm convinced we were. I haven't run the numbers. I need to find a good database for the total number of companies. And I keep finding out about companies that I hadn't been aware of in the past. For example, there was a saddle making company in Milwaukee that I just found out about in the last week and a half or so, that was producing leather goods for holsters and machine guns and things like that. They weren't on my list. There's numerous other companies, I'm sure, that played a role, but I'm quite certain that we were ahead of the curve.
We'll say we are anyway. It's our presentation. We can say what we want. All right, one more question, and then we'll let everybody go. So Paul wants to know, obviously we are Brew City, right? Paul wants to know, did Milwaukee breweries make any contributions to the war effort? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, well, they did. In fact, we tried in the exhibit to represent that properly. We went out searching for camouflage beer cans. Milwaukee beer was shipped overseas to the troops, and specialty beer cans were produced that were camouflaged. They were, similar. You could see a Miller can, for example, that would have its traditional shape, but it was all in like a camouflage green, if you will, so that it didn't stand out real significantly, I guess. But yeah,
shoot your beer can.
We shipped, I'm sure, hundreds of thousands of cases of beer to the troops. I don't know if it was 3-2 beer or not. In my tenure in the service, You know, I was limited to 3-2 beer for quite a while, and I always was convinced that you could drink an awful lot of beer before you ever experienced anything from it.
That's pretty funny. Well, Tom, again, thanks so much for the talk tonight, and thanks so much for all the work you've done on both this project and the magnificent machines and local history, especially from this industrial point of view. It's definitely noted and appreciated by us at the Historical Society. The book is for sale at MilwaukeeHistory.net. So if you want to get it there, again, you can come in during local business hours, and if you track Tom down, I'm sure he'll sign a copy of it for you too.
I'd be delighted to.
Everybody stay safe. That exhibit is going on at the War Memorial Center through the end of the year. We've got our exhibit on Milwaukee politics going on through November too. And next week's program is about spooky and scandalous Milwaukee. Ooh. Getting in the Halloween spirit, no pun intended. Next week, Thursday, 7:30 on the Milwaukee County Historical Society's channel here on Facebook and YouTube. So thanks for the War Memorial Center for collaborating tonight. And Tom, thank you so much.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks for inviting me, John.
And everybody stay safe, and we'll hope to see you next week.